Okay, hello again, British and American culture class. Um, this is the second cyber lecture we're doing this week because last one was delayed. So this is the second of the two you have to watch. You can tell the order because the previous one was the 16th century and this one's the 17th. So although, as I said, I'm skipping over a lot of details, remember the things I write on the board and the things that I emphasize when I say, pay attention to this. Sometimes I tell some stories and give some details or make some comparisons to other countries or to something familiar to Koreans or our international students. I don't put those things on the test. Remember that. That's just to help you remember and help you to understand and to make the course relevant, right? We're not just studying this course just to be experts about British and American culture. We're supposed to be learning how things work and how we can apply some of the ideas and some of the perspectives and analyses that we do in this class to other places. I myself am from Canada and now I live in Korea. So, works both ways. I apply a lot of the things I know about English, Canadian and English culture and use it here. And but I also have to understand Korean culture. And when I go back to Canada, I use the things that I learn here and the ideas that I learn from Korean people when I'm back home. So the same goes for all of you. We're working our way towards the end of chapter 3. I have to emphasize that this is the last lecture before we write quiz 3. Most of the stuff that I talk about today, except for this sort of omnipresent 5-factor thing, that's, as I told you, that's definitely going to be on the quiz. These ideas you have to remember, because basically from Henry VIII to all the way to the material at the end of the 17th century at the midterm exam, these 5 things are in the background all the time. This lecture, they're going to become critical, but they're always there. Queen Elizabeth managed them well. Henry VIII doesn't care. Edward doesn't really have to manage them because he's too young. Mary has bigger problems related to religion. But when King James becomes the king, he also, like Henry VIII, tends to ignore these problems, but he doesn't have the big personality and the political authority and what can I say, leadership. He's not as scary, he's not as intimidating as Henry VIII is, and so they become problems for him, even though he tries to ignore them. So what happens in 1603 is Queen Elizabeth dies, and she doesn't really say till the very last minute who is going to be the next king or queen. So everybody's pretty nervous. At this point, although she is, I said already, I think she deserves to be called Queen Elizabeth the Great. By the time she dies, the English people are fairly tired of her. She is what you call stingy. She's very frugal. She doesn't spend a lot of money. She's not very generous, and she's old. She's not a beautiful, young, intelligent, flashy leader who can basically charm the entire kingdom into her hands. Now she's basically needs to be retired, but she's still alive. There's no retirement for kings and queens, so she's old and she's probably she's not in very good health, and she passes away. So when she passes away, people are pretty relieved to see her go, in a way. But of course, they remember everything that has happened. The victories against Spain, the defense, the great administration she provided, and the people like the heroes like Francis Drake, the most famous privateer who traveled around the world and defeated the Spanish over and over until he himself died. All these things happened. Shakespeare did the first half of his career and many other famous poets and playwrights owe a lot to this old lady. And so she is mourned universally, but there's a lot of nervousness about who's going to replace her. And there is some relief that she is finally gone. So the guy who is in the end she decides to choose is related to her, but not to a direct descendant. So his family name is Stuart, which is a royal family from Scotland, and he becomes the King of Scotland and England. Now this doesn't create Great Britain yet. James actually, when he becomes king, comes down and he's crowned. So he has two crowns. They're separate countries. So it's a strange thing. You can almost think about it as like a CEO being the CEO of two separate companies and managing them at the same time. So there's still the Scottish Council, and there's still a Scottish government, Scottish kingdom. It still exists. He tries to pass legislation to unify the kingdoms under him, obviously, but it's rejected. So until 100 years later, when the Act of Union actually combines the two kingdoms, every English king will also be the King of Scotland at the same time, which is interesting situation, but it's going to happen for the entire 17th century. That's part of the problem. This is exacerbating, obviously, local control. Who's controlling Scotland? Well, King James goes to London, and even though he thinks London stinks, and let's talk about London for a second, because London is always the X factor. He comes down from Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, and he comes down, and he thinks London is awful. He thinks it's disgusting, and it is. At this time, in 1603 and the early 1600s, it's easily the biggest city in England, and it's only getting bigger. The population of England is growing now, but there's not enough work. So they've got an unemployment crisis, and inflation is going up, which in the Middle Ages, inflation didn't really exist. Inflation would be like 10% over 100 years. So you wouldn't even notice the change in price, or it would be pretty much flat. In 10 years, during Queen Elizabeth's reign, it goes up 10%, which is 1% per year, which we would think was nothing, because in modern economies, as our Asia business students know, 1 or 2% is ideal. You don't want it to be zero. There should be some inflation, should be some upward pressure. Otherwise, it means your economy is not growing. But they actually don't know how to adjust wages and costs to inflation at even 1% a year. So costs are going up, population's going up, jobs don't pay any more than they did before, and there's not enough jobs. So we have a whole bunch of people wandering around. We would call them immigrants, but they would call them a sort of immigrant. Moving around within your own country is not a kind of immigration, though. You're not moving across borders, but sometimes they would call them immigrants because they were moving into London. But most likely these wandering people, they call them vagrants. Their kind of word for a vagrant, a kind of homeless, jobless, wandering person. And the government basically thinks it's their fault. They don't understand that there's just not enough work. The golden age of labor was in the Middle Ages. Even though there was the Black Death, there was always enough work. Now there's not. So they have a kind of dilemma what to do with these people. They think that they're lazy and they're not trying to work, but that's not really the case. For the most part, they want to work, but there's no jobs. So that's something that James has to deal with. And when you're a vagrant, there's the idea that because London is so big and it has the most jobs, that's the best place you can go. It's not necessarily true, but that's where everybody ends up going. So there's more men in London than women because of the migration. The birth rate, therefore, is a little bit lower than it should be, but it's just a disgusting city. Lots of people are dying. It's growing by people moving to it, but more people are dying than people are being born. So that the mortality rate in London is very high. It's a very dirty city. For every 35 people born in London, 40 people die. But the population is still going up very fast because so many people are moving from the countryside. James thinks it's a horrible city. And he thinks sooner or later, all of England is just going to be London. It's just going to be sucked in. Sometimes I feel that about Korea, Sooner or later, Seoul, there's just going to be one city in Korea. It's just all of Korea is going to live in Seoul, which I think is a terrible idea too. I agree with James. James was an interesting guy. He presided over the very beginnings of the colonies in America. The Virginia Company establishes itself in Virginia, what is now Virginia, and makes a small settlement called Jamestown. So we're going to talk about this after the quiz because I don't want to entangle too many ideas with what's going to be on the quiz on Friday. But James, the things that are significant that start under him are all these social and financial and political problems he kind of sweeps them under the rug, and he brings some of his retinue, some of his court down from Scotland. And although I told you Queen Elizabeth is poor, King James, when he comes from Scotland, you got to remember, Scotland's a much smaller country with less resources and less people, a smaller economy. And when he comes to London, he suddenly feels like his ship has come in and that he's won the lottery. So he feels like he's rich. So he just keeps spending money, not realizing that he's making an impossible situation for his son. So Queen Elizabeth was painfully aware of how much debt she was accumulating, but she kept it under control. But James really didn't understand that even though England was wealthier than Scotland, that the government, the kingdom, and the royal budget was strained already. So he didn't really even attempt to manage the budget the way Henry VII or the way Queen Elizabeth did. He just had lots of fancy parties and spent a lot of money on building projects, and he wasn't into war. He thought he was the sort of European peacemaker, so he didn't spend a lot of money on war, which was good because he didn't have enough money to fight a war, so that was a good policy. But he spent a lot of money on his household for sure, and he didn't restrain himself when it came to artistic endeavors, patronage of the arts, festivals and parties and sports and hunting and building projects and supporting his household or family members, fancy clothes or anything else. The royal household budget was too high, and so he continued to make the financial problem worse. One of the things he's most famous for is he commissioned the King James Bible, which still is really considered the official English Bible. He had a team of scholars put it together. It's sort of almost on the level, not on the level of King Sejong creating Hangul per se, but it's the same kind of project, like not just translating the Bible into English, but creating a language to express the religious ideas and the stories and the events of the Bible in the correct way. So we had a team of expert scholars, religious theologians, and so on, who are fluent in Latin and Greek and English, and they put together the King James. We call it the KJV. the King James Version of the Bible. And it's my favorite because it is the most beautiful, I think. And a lot of the phrases, expressions, idioms in the English language for the last 400 years that we see in the newspaper, in literature, in movies, they go right back to those phrases and sentences and words that were created in order to put the Bible into English verse. So that's one of his greatest contributions. He started the colonization of England. You have to remember, we'll talk about this too, Ireland has already been colonized essentially, but that will continue, and they will begin colonizing America and other places under James. He will support that project. Now, what else do I need to say today without interfering with our quiz? There is going to be a civil war, and I think on Friday it's better for me to talk about how exactly that plays out. But when King James dies, his son Charles ascends to the throne. And these religious things that, again, Queen Elizabeth was very skillful at keeping sort of everybody not happy, but everybody content with their situation, whether they were Catholic or Anglican or Scottish. The Scottish decide they want to be Protestant too, so there's going to be a Church of Scotland, but then there's also going to be Catholic Scottish to make things even more confusing. But religiously, these things start to fall apart because King James really likes Anglican and Catholic religion, and the Scottish people are really starting to not like Anglican. They were okay with being Catholic, but when King James decides that they should be Anglican, they're like, no, Scotland's going to have its own church. So they start to do that. And under James, they keep the peace. But once Charles becomes the king, he thinks that all of his kingdoms, because he's the king of Scotland, he tries to force the Scottish to become Anglican. And that is too much. The Scottish people have no interest in, they can handle having a English Scottish king, but they can't handle being told how to worship by the English church. They don't want to be subjugated to the English church. They will follow the king, but not the English religion that is created by Henry VIII. They refuse. So the Church of Scotland begins to assert itself, and Charles tries to force them to do it militarily, but he fails. When he fails to do that, he makes enemies of pretty much his entire kingdom, which he's the king fighting his own kingdom. This costs him a lot of money, which, there's already a money problem. So here again, just like Henry VIII, you got enough money to go around, and then you start a war and you lose it, and all of a sudden you have a financial crisis. So you have to talk to Parliament. Parliament's not interested in giving him money so that he can fight against the Scots. So he's unable to do these things that he wants to sort of have control, just like an absolute king. Right back to King John and the Magna Carta. Remember, one of the biggest problems was King John wanted to have absolute power. He wanted to tax, or he wanted to use whoever he needed in the kingdom, and the population, especially the wealthy people, said, no, you're just the leader of the kingdom. You don't have absolute authority. Even though you're chosen by God, you still have to abide by humane rules, and you have to be responsible to the state. You can't just rule by your own will and not consult the other important people in the realm. So the Magna Carta is going to come up over and over again as a sort of starting point for this process, where Parliament says that King Charles is trying to be a tyrant. He's trying to control the entire kingdom by himself, to be a sovereign ruler and not to respect the sovereignty of Parliament. And this is going to finally, because of all of the differences on many issues between King Charles and the Parliament, where they can't agree or cooperate on anything. Eventually, it's going to get to the point where they're threatening each other, and then they start to raise armies, and then they start to fight battles over who is going to have control over the kingdom. So that's, I guess that's a story for another day. This is a really short cyber lecture compared to my normal ones, but I as I said, not very much of this material is on the quiz. I think there's enough in chapter, chapter 3 is the longest chapter, so that I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information. Most of the stuff is concentrated on the quiz on the 16th century, so make sure you know that stuff well, and take a look at this lecture too. But we'll continue, and in Friday's lecture, we'll continue through to the end of the 17th century, talk about the Civil War and the fallout from that, and then we'll have to wrap everything up because the following week we have the midterm. So one more lecture on Friday. As I said, next Wednesday there isn't going to be a cyber lecture. I'll just let you prepare for the midterm. So thank you for listening again, and make sure you study up for Friday's quiz. That's at 11 o'clock. Don't be late. Have a good day.